Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler, and my guest today is my dear friend in St. Louis, Dr. Tim Bagwell. And Dr. Bagwell wrote his PhD thesis on the student loan debt crisis, and we're going to talk about the history of that today. So, Tim, when you first started writing it, the the problem was not as bad as it is today, right?
I would say it's very comparable, but no, not as bad. There's more people in debt, and the very fact that we were hit by COVID and people were losing jobs and all of that, with the forbearance that we now have, it's obviously a larger problem.
Mm-hmm.
44 million people with, I think it's, forget the total debt, but in the trillions basically that people owe, and it's the largest debt following their mortgage, and that's bigger than their credit cards, bigger than the car. It's a
Wow.
major problem. It's a major
So
problem.
tell us a little bit about the beginning.
Right. So what one of the things that's happened in all this is that people they see the student loan program now, and they have what they think, well, they see it very simplistically as the government made you a loan, you went to school, and now you're having trouble repaying it, but you're obligated to repay it because you signed a contract, and that's all they see it as if it were a credit card, as if it were a mortgage, as if it were a car loan, and it's completely different than any of those things. For one thing, it's with the government or with a government supported organization like a student loan guarantor or a program with a bank in the earlier days, where you would get these loans and they were subsidized by the government. Um, but but the question is, where did it come from? Historically, why do we have something like the student loan program? And it goes at least as far back as the aftermath of World War One. In the aftermath of World War One, veterans. You had veterans, and you had the Great Depression. And the veterans had been promised a bonus for having uh, gone to war for the United States and Europe, and they weren't. The government wasn't paying that bonus. And you have what was called the Bonus Army that led a protest movement to Washington and occupied the mall. And you had these veterans of the First World War demanding to be paid. This is at the end of the Hoover administration, demanding to be paid their bonus for what they have done for the country, and so that they could do whatever with the money. At this point, it's maybe not so much education, but it was something that the Army had done, people had joined up for, and something they expected. And what happened was is that the crowd was the demonstrators. The tent city was eventually uh, first attempted to be moved by the DC police, and then Douglas MacArthur, long before he was a great commander in World War II, brought in National Guard forces and cleared them all of the Bonus Army. Not exactly good public relations, and not a good look at what happens to veterans. And if you think about it, this is the kind of thing that also happened in Nazi Germany, was that you had a losing country, even in worse economic conditions, and veterans who eventually organized into terrible political parties like the Nazi Party. And basically, you had young men who had been trained in military rigors and discipline, and just ripe for recruitment into a fascistic political model like the Nazi Party. So you want to kind of avoid having things like that happen in your society.
Mm-hmm.
If you use hundreds of thousands or millions of people, men, mostly men, to fight your war, you better pay them back.
Right.
Elsewise, you could end up with a miserable situation. So part of what they try to do with that was eventually the bonus gets paid around the same time that another program was put into place, and that was the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was in response to how many, not so much the veterans, but to vast unemployed, mostly again young men who needed work and who needed training. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was created to put young men back to work and to give them training in basic manual skills such as construction in particular, into building small buildings, into building bridges and highways and that sort of thing. And this again was in part to make sure that these folks didn't get organized into an army that would be harmful to the government of the United States. And in fact, there's records of it's records, but there were business interests at the time that would have preferred that an army be organized, that these people be organized into an army, and that a more authoritarian form of government be instituted. But fortunately, that didn't happen. Roosevelt prevailed, and we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. So that was and at the same time, the bonus army gets paid. Things are a little bit better. And then the Second World War comes along, and again, more people are brought into the military, the service of the military, men and women. And at the end of the war, more people are coming home and will be looking for work. But this time they got ahead of just in time a little bit. In 1944, the government created the Readjustment Act, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1934, which was the GI Bill. And this provided funds for GIs for returning veterans for education, not just education, but for home loans or business loans, and a way to transition into the middle class, transition between employed by the military and not yet employed by industry. They could go into education they could go into college for a while, and then go into the workforce and become, as the greatest generation, see their aspirations fulfilled with following the Second World War, the greatest peacetime economy in the history of the world. So you have the GI Bill helping to fuel and helping to pay back, and for the work that had been done by the veterans, but also a rise in expectations, an expectation that in part leads to the baby boom, and also an expectation that they want something better for their children, and that's. The kids aren't this time. The children are just being born. They're not quite ready for college yet, but it's something lingering in the background of the hopes and ambitions of these of the greatest generation, those returning from the Second World War. And then what happens, along with this boom, what happens is that little beep in the sky from Sputnik in 1957, October 4th, 1957, the Russians, the Soviets launched Sputnik. So they're the first in space. The Russians and their scientists get into space before we do, much to the shock and dismay of the country. And with this, Eisenhower, who had trouble getting anything passed in his legislative agenda unless he connected it to military somehow. The highway system, the interstate highway system, was built as a kind of military project to protect the country, to be able to move resources across the country. It was almost always connected to the military when Eisenhower wanted to get something done. And so with Sputnik, there was a great fear that we had not funded our science well enough in our universities and had not brought enough people into the sciences to be competitive with the Soviets. So along with the interstate highway system, the National Defense Education Act of 1958 was passed a year after Sputnik. So we have the first federally backed student loans in the form of the National Defense Education Act. I should point out that there were small loan programs at the state level in a number of states, such as Massachusetts, as one might expect, being a center of education that Massachusetts is. There were a number of places, and even in Indiana, and I don't know where of all the states, which ones had early programs, but those were two. And the Indiana one is particularly interesting because there's links to Indiana that will develop in the history of the student loan program. So we have the National Defense Education Act, and originally it was designed to fund degrees in the sciences. So people could go in and get funding not just loans, but funds, grants for science and engineering, basically an early STEM program, science, technology, engineering, and math. This was like an early STEM program sponsored by the government, largely through the defense, through the Department of Defense. So here's where it gets interesting: is that the people involved in this, among them Neil McElroy, the Secretary of Defense. Neil McElroy was Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense at the time, and he's known through his work at Procter and Gamble as the father of branding. So he was famous for developing branding mechanisms for Procter and Gamble that became commonly used throughout industry in the United States. But he also had a strong interest in the financial support of enrollment in higher education. With this, he was linked with another Eisenhower advisor, Edward McCabe. One moment, please. So these two guys become essential in the foundations. They're sort of there's two of the three founding fathers of the student loan program. These two are the most closely linked to the administration. McCabe, he was associate counsel to President Eisenhower, and he previously was counsel for the Education and Labor Committee in the U.S. House, and very much connected to the Republican Party. And he is central to the creation and development of Sallie Mae.
Okay, let me ask you this. You're talking about three particular guys that started this. If those three men were to know what's going on today, do you think they would be shocked?
McCabe would not, because McCabe actually is there for almost the entire period through the changes that with the creation of Sallie Mae. He was around when Sallie Mae lobbied for the change of the bankruptcy laws. We'll talk about that in another time. But no, he's not shocked at all. Okay. McElroy might be. The other gentleman out of Indiana was a guy named Richard Cornwell, who was a libertarian. And maybe he would be shocked, but I don't think he would. So his idea, because who knows how the libertarians actually think in terms of government, his idea was that he wanted to establish an organization to compete with the government in making student loans. And he would become the founder of United Student Aid Funds out of Indianapolis, Indiana, out of Fishers, Indiana, actually, north suburb of Indianapolis. And a strong libertarian with this idea that student loans could be provided through non-governmental entities, but it quickly becomes intertwined with Sallie Mae and with the federal government. So not anything like a libertarian model of how things are supposed to work. So these three guys, Cornwell, McElroy, and McCabe are central, with McCabe being there all the way. I think he makes it into, let me check. I think McCabe makes it into our century here.
Okay, maybe we could talk at length, maybe not today, but maybe in subsequent shows on the origin of Sallie Mae. What do you think?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's going to be. He's essential to the origins of Sallie Mae.
Okay.
But Sallie Mae doesn't quite get organized in this episode, so to speak. It's sort of one of the turning points. The formation of Sallie Mae is one of the turning points of how we run how the government runs, and how the economy runs the student loan program.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's a little bit later on, and I just wanted to get some information for you quickly here on McCabe's biography and when he essentially left the program. He became wealthy out of student loans, though, out of his work with Sallie Mae. He was one moment. Edward. I was trying to remember his first name. It was Edgar or Edward McCabe. Sorry for the delay here. Edward. So, so what happens before Sallie Mae, then one of the enablers of Sallie Mae, was, one second. Trying to see where his year of passing was. Oh, 2008. Yeah. Curiously, curiously, October 4th, 2008, the anniversary, the anniversary of Sputnik. I just realized that. That he died on the anniversary of Sputnik. How very interesting. So is that a 50-year anniversary? I think a 50-year anniversary of Sputnik right there. So so that's when McCabe passes, and he's involved with the student. He's involved with Sallie Mae and USA Funds. He was on the board of USA Funds from 1978 to 1996, and he was chair of Sallie Mae 81 to 90, and he was a board member all the way through to his death. Wait a minute, that was Lumina Foundation. Well, Lumina Foundation for Education, another student loan related organization, through 2008. So he was active in the student loans from the 1950s to the first decade of our century here. So he's kind of the linchpin founder of the student loan program in many ways. But where I last left you was with the National Defense Education Act. And they kind of realized that they needed to do more than just, there are people who were wanting education. We're starting to get to the point in the early 60s where some of the early baby boom are in high school now, looking toward college. So you have the Great Generation having spawned this baby boom, excuse me. And by 1965, you've got people who are 15, 16 years old, and the sons and daughters of the baby boom, and looking toward the future, and how are they going to get the education that was afforded them? At this time, there's not a huge war going on, though there is one developing in Vietnam. But so what's passed is the Higher Education Act of 1965. And what it does is establish the Basic Educational Grant Program, which later becomes the Pell Grant, and a loan program, which later becomes Stafford loans.
Okay.
So higher education. So essentially, they've taken they've taken student loans away from the Defense Department, and they've put them into higher ed, into what will become the Department of Education, and into loan programs for basically any program of higher education certified as eligible for support with student loans. And here's what's going on, is that this is 1965 through, say, about 1975. Higher education is a fairly good deal. You can still work part-time and largely put yourself through college, and not part-time, at least almost full-time, and put yourself through college. Or your parents, during this great economic boom, actually can set enough aside and help you through college without acquiring a large debt. But for those who can't, here we have the Pell Grant, what becomes the Pell Grant, Basic Educational Opportunity Grant, and the Federal Student Loan Program, or the Stafford Loan Program. What these two programs are basically stopgap measures. We have the hopes and dreams of this baby boom generation, the hopes and dreams of the Great Generation for their children. And you have a good, a well-controlled, non-inflationary environment for the cost of higher education, where, like I said, you could put yourself through college, working part-time, or with the help of your parents, with a second mortgage even. There was enough equity out there that you could fairly well put yourself through school. So the Pell Grants and the Stafford loans were sort of a stopgap measure. And what happens is it's largely a grant program for
Mhm.
this time period up until the 19 late 1970s, early 80s. The Higher Education Act provides for these two programs, with 70% of the funds being in the form of grants and 30% being in the form of loans. So
Mhm.
loans were still at this time of these two stopgap measures to help families and individuals go to college. Loans were still a stopgap. When you couldn't get the scholarship, when you couldn't get the Pell Grant, or if the program that you were in required more money, there was the loan. And almost everybody who could get into a qualified higher education program could get one of those loans.
Mhm.
And those loans, they weren't that big, because again, they were stopgaps. The price of education wasn't that bad. And that was uh, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. But they were um, uh, it was a good deal.
Okay, let me
Yeah.
ask you this.
Uh-huh.
For somebody that went to school to be a doctor
Yep.
or a lawyer
Yep.
or, an elite professional,
Right.
and they had to borrow after that the Pell Grant and stuff. On the
Yeah, because
average,
The Pell Grants certainly weren't for the those. Yeah, go ahead.
so what was the average debt for people who were going into an elite profession
I,
at
I
that
don't
point?
I don't have the figure in front of me. Um, it's also interesting when they actually started qualifying those programs. I'd have to get you some information on that. That's a very good question.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, of course, they do become qualified, because that's the issue now. That's one of the issues, is that so much money has gone into PhDs and MDs and JDs,
Mm-hmm.
that those are very expensive programs, and especially the PhDs and the MDs taking a lot. They're not just 3-year programs like the JDs are, like the Juris Doctorates are. So there's you know um, and they become part of the early part of the problem. As strange as the elite professions become part of the problem, but also trade schools become part of the problem, because eventually trade schools are allowed to participate, and with a number of those trades not necessarily being a good deal in terms of job opportunity. And what you would have is, you won't have $100,000 loan, but you could have a $5,000 loan for a person who's not going to see a job for $30,000.
Mm-hmm.
So that becomes a burden for them. And there's a larger number of them than there are MDs and JDs and PhDs with those large loans.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where a number of uh, for the longest time in the 1990s, there used to be an emphasis on reporting on the MDs, PhDs, and JDs with their loans they're not paying back, without realization that who's not paying back the loans are the poor people who got stuck with a bad deal with a trade school that wasn't going to be able to help them get the qualifications they needed, or in a market that was going to provide enough jobs in the education that they were receiving. And it
Mm-hmm.
still continues to be a problem of specialized trade school, when so many of the trades were taken away. So many of the trades were taken away, and with the export of jobs and that sort of thing. So uh, it starts to some problems start to develop early on. Not early on, but about the middle of by the 70s, and by the 70s, this with again inflation setting in, and with a bad economy, um, more people are back in school, and there's an upswing in demand for education, and the prices also start to rise. I can remember entering undergraduate at a state university for about $300 a semester, where I could do my first 12 hours for the 300 and some dollars, and I could go up to 18, and then I could get the next 6 hours for free. So it may have
Mm-hmm.
been 350 a semester for 18 hours if I could do the 18 hours.
Mm-hmm.
but eventually that goes away. And by the time I graduate with my bachelor's degree, I'm almost $800 a semester. It's more than a doubling in just 4 years from the early '70s to the late '70s.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this growth in the demand. And what happens too, and I spoke to when I was doing my research, I spoke to an inspector general who worked at the Department of Education, who confidentially reported to me that the big part of the inflation in higher education expenses, higher ed education costs run way ahead of almost every sector of the economy right now, except maybe for gasoline.
Mm-hmm.
But the inflation rate is what he compared it to was auto parts are expensive because insurance companies are paying for auto parts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you with damaged vehicles, insurance companies end up paying for auto parts, driving the cost up because a person to it's not a consumer to provider transaction. It's consumer provider with an insurance company involved, and the price goes up. Same thing with student loans. It's not actually at the time. It's not the consumer paying the higher education institution. It's the lender, though the student's going to have to pay it back. But what happens is that this money ends up going into administration, into more administrative positions, higher administrative salaries, stagnation of faculty hiring and a stagnation of faculty salaries, and the hiring of adjuncts. Another whole topic in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the price of higher education is the adjunctification, if you will, of a lot of the teaching. Um, but to kind of get closer to wrapping up here about the foundations of it, is that the foundations go back to a very Republican, a very business oriented framework, not what some people believe is a nice government program handout to the poor. That's not what this is. It became an opportunistic way of being kind of gatekeepers to the middle class. If you want to get into the middle class, you got to pay the fee, and the fees are student loans.
Mm-hmm.
And it evolved from being a stopgap measure of grants and loans to a necessity. You have to get the loan in order to go into education, go into
Right.
higher.
And Tim, on that note, we've got to close for the day.
Okay, well, that's
So,
perfect because we can pick up on the regulatory framework and how things changed and got worse even for student loan borrowers next episode.
right. So you've been listening to Dr. Tim Bagwell. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube page. Tim, thanks so much. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody, for listening and watching. Have a great day.
Thank you, Cynthia.